episode of Excerpts from Experts is sponsored by Taylor Kelsham Real Estate, the community's agent. Thank you for your support. If you would like to sponsor one of our episodes, email us at mediateam@childfamilycenter.org.
Hi everyone, welcome to our episode today. We will be focusing on domestic violence, fact versus fiction. I'm here with Mariana Smith, a program manager of our domestic violence program at Child and Family Center. And today we're just going to talk about commonly held misperceptions of what domestic violence is. Welcome, Mariana.
Hi, thank you.
So let's start with the misperception that domestic violence only affects a small amount of people.
Sure. That's actually a really common misconception because we don't think that it's happening because we don't really talk about domestic violence. But actually, nearly 20 people a minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. And that's just talking about domestic violence between an intimate partner. That's not even getting into family violence. And during 1 year, that equates to more than about 10 million people. And 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by their intimate partner. And if you think about it, intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all of the violent crime that's reported to the police. And again, we're just talking about intimate partner violence. So we're not even getting into family violence, right? And on a typical day, more than 20,000 phone calls are placed to domestic violence hotlines. Also, the thing to keep in mind is that all of these statistics are really underreported because oftentimes men don't feel comfortable to report domestic violence. People in same-sex relationships oftentimes can be miscategorized, and the domestic violence that's occurring in the intimate partner violence can be categorized as assault. And so all of those things, and also the stigma around coming forward, all of those things contribute to having kind of lower statistics than we actually know domestic violence is occurring.
So important. So it's actually, based off the statistics that we have, it's most likely much more going on than what we are aware of.
Absolutely.
And I think it's so important based off what's going on right now with COVID-19, with so many households under quarantine, that exhibits, an additional risk factor for some families.
Absolutely. What we know is that reports of domestic violence are increasing to the police. But what's very interesting is that calls to hotlines are decreasing. And what that really speaks to is the ability for somebody who's going through domestic violence in the environment right now with COVID and everybody being isolated in their homes. It really limits the survivor's access to a safe environment to make calls to hotlines to be able to receive resources and find out about shelter. Additionally, people who are in shelter are needing to stay longer, and there may be less beds.
So important. And I wanted to speak to, another myth that comes up is that with domestic violence, it's all about someone losing control.
Absolutely. So, violent behavior is actually a choice the abuser makes. And rather than losing control, the perpetrator of the domestic violence is using that control and using the violence to actually control their victims. So it's really about the batterers using the control, not losing the control. And the actions are very deliberate. A good way to think about it is that when somebody is being abusive in a domestic violence relationship, that is when they are in the most control.
And that really, I think, is a sharp contrast to what we think commonly, that it's something that, really triggers someone and they act out violently. And that also comes down to our thought that drugs and alcohol also have an impact on increased violence in domestic violence relationships.
Absolutely. And, drugs and alcohol don't cause abusive behavior. When you include drugs and alcohol into an environment that is already abusive, it can oftentimes exacerbate the stress and amplify the abuse in the situation, but it doesn't cause it. People who abuse while they're using substances or alcohol are likely to still abuse when they're sober. And it can often be used by abusers as an excuse for the excessive behavior. So going back to that point of I just lost control, it's the alcohol, and if I just get sober, this will stop. And then that kind of lends to the idea of why it can be difficult to leave a relationship, especially if you think that the cause could be the substance use.
Mm-hmm. And I think it leads to a lot of self-blame, right, of the survivor. And that leads right into, that point of it's so hard to leave. And I think a lot of people, when they hear about domestic violence, they're like, well, why doesn't the survivor just leave the relationship?
And I think that, that's a really interesting place to kind of sit and think about, because oftentimes when we think about somebody being abused, this is somebody that they love and that they believe loves them, right? Because this abuse is a learned behavior. And oftentimes somebody who is in a domestic violence relationship has likely experienced abuse in the past. And so this is a learned behavior that is identified as love. And oftentimes they don't want to end their relationship with the person that they're with. They really just want the abuse to stop. And other factors contribute. Even if they do want to end the relationship, there may be economic dependence. They might not be able to work given the control that the batterer has in that relationship. If there's children, there may be insecurities about supporting those children alone, or the love that the children have for the abuser, and the love and concern that the survivor has for the abuser, right? Additionally, it's important to think about the fact that 75% of homicides related to intimate partner violence occur when somebody is trying to leave the relationship. So that fear of a more severe beating or even death is a really valid fear. And oftentimes, if a survivor has attempted to leave before, when they've returned, the abuse has increased. They could have fear of losing the custody of their children. If they reach out to the police and DCFS are to get involved, and maybe DCFS detains the children, or they've seen that happen elsewhere, that could be a real influence as, to why they might stay. Additionally, Monica, you have to think about religious, moral, and family pressures just to make the relationship work. Lack of emotional support. Oftentimes when somebody is in a domestic violence relationship, one of the tactics of abuse is to isolate that person, the survivor, from their supportive people in their lives. And so that lack of emotional support could be a reason. And then one major reason, which is why it's so important that we're having these types of conversations, is just knowledge about the resources and the stigma around being a survivor of domestic violence, right? And the way that we look at it, and that myth that says if this person didn't want to be in this relationship, they would just leave, or that idea of I would never put up with that. And something that, was said to me early on in my career in domestic violence was that, a lot of us experience emotional abuse or verbal abuse sometimes, or even physical from our parents in our lifetime. And we maintain our relationships with our parents because it can be very difficult to cut those off. And that's a very good place to start from when we try to understand somebody staying in these types of relationships. And then just to kind of bring it back to the substance use and the loss of control, it's this belief that the abuser is going to change the behavior and that this will never happen again. There's a cycle of abuse, right? And you have your honeymoon phase, your tension phase, and your explosion. And in that honeymoon stage, right after the explosion, the batterer is going to give you everything you hoped was going to happen in it. It might not be everything, but it's a little more than last time, enough to give you hope, right? And apologies and all of those things that make you feel like maybe this won't happen again. And if they just get help with their substance use, or they just go to counseling for their anger, then we'll be able to work this out.
So important. And I think what you're really sharing with us is that it's a complex and layered relationship, and it's dangerous, and it's powerful for the survivor to identify what is safest for me at this point. Someone that I'm living with someone that I do love, however, there is that abusive factor.
Absolutely.
And thinking about that, you had mentioned culture and potentially economic dependence. I think another myth out there is that domestic violence only happens within a certain economic status or cultural group. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So what we see is that survivors that are that may have a lower income might come to shelters and seek public resources at a greater rate because they have fewer resources than other women. But actually, domestic violence happens in families of all social, ethnic, racial, educational, and religious backgrounds. It's in towns and suburbs and cities and rural areas. And what we find is actually the frequency and the severity of the violence among lower income people versus the frequency and severity among middle class and upper class is actually the same.
Mm-hmm. I really want to thank you for bringing light to this such an important topic. And it's sometimes taboo to talk about these things, right? Because it's not right in front of us.
Sure.
So if anyone watching this is in a domestic violence relationship, or their loved one is, what would you say? What would be kind of the first step for them?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to try to be non-judgmental, and really understand that this is something that they're not doing to themselves. It's happening to them. And be available for that support. But I really encourage reaching out to a domestic violence hotline, we have one as well, and we'll provide that information. So that way you could talk to an advocate, and an advocate can help you with safety planning and ways to stay safe, and helping you with access to resources and understanding what is out there for you or for your family member or friend that might need support or help.
And also that hotline could support if you had questions about a restraining order or anything in terms of navigating legal aspects as well, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Legal support, housing resources. And if somebody just kind of needs to talk and process what's going on, you might not be in a place where you're ready to leave at this moment, but you just want to kind of reflect on what's going on and see what options there may be, and a hotline can be helpful for that.
Exactly. Thank you so much. I do want to share our hotline number. It is a 24-hour DV hotline, 661-259-HELP or 4357. Thank you so much, Mariana, for joining us. We're going to be adding additional resources to this link for further reading for anyone who is interested. Thank you again for sharing this incredibly important information.
Thank you, Monica.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great one.